Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Lunchbox Talk with the North Carolina Botanical Garden. I'm Joanna Lalikas, and I'm the Director of Education here at the Garden. We're so excited to have you here at the start of our fall season Lunchbox Talk series. Today, I'm excited to bring you Dr. Suzanne Lye, who will be sharing with us about plants and ancient magic and medicine. I'd like to acknowledge our Fall 2021 Lunchbox Talk event host, our own garden director, Damon Waite, for sponsoring our Fall Lunchbox Talk series at the dogwood level. And this really helps us fund support for program planning and for reaching a broad audience, including support for captioning recorded talks that are made available to the public. So I'd like to introduce David Michaud as my partner in moderation today. He'll be assisting our speaker with Q&A. Suzanne is an assistant professor in the Department of Classics here at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And she received her AB from Harvard University, where she studied organic chemistry and the history of antibiotics. After receiving her PhD in classics from the University of California in Los Angeles, she was awarded a postdoc fellowship at Dartmouth College. Her first book project focuses on conceptions of the afterlife in ancient Greek underworld narratives from Homer to Lucian. Her next project will focus on women's anger and ancient literature and magic. She's published on ancient epic, ancient magic and religion, ancient representations of gender and ethnicity, ancient and modern pedagogy, and classical reception. Additionally, she's contributed to several digital humanities initiatives through Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, including the Homer Multitext Project. So Suzanne, thank you for joining us today. We're very excited about your talk.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank Joanna and David for having me and for everybody here in the North Carolina Botanical Garden. Thank you all for being here, for inviting me to do this Lunchbox Talk. I'm really excited to share some interesting things from the ancient world with you in an area that I really find fascinating, which is sort of the everyday use of different things in the environment and how that intersects with belief and magic. So I'm going to share my screen. So the title of my talk today is Plants and Ancient Magic and Religion. And, you know, I know that not everybody here maybe has studied the ancient world or knows that much about the ancient world. So just to give you a little roadmap of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll talk about every part of this title so you understand what I mean by the ancient world, which ancient world I'm talking about, what I mean by magic and what I mean by religion, and how plants fit into that. So I'll do that in that order. And at the end, kind of towards the end of my talk, I'll use some case studies of plants we kind of know about and tell you how they were used in everyday life in the ancient world. So first of all, I'm going to show you maps because it's good to get oriented into the space that we're talking about. And what I'm focusing on today is the Greco-Roman world. And so this is what the Greek world looked like in 8th century BCE. This is when the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were written down. And they're some of our earliest sources about the use of plants, mostly in healing, sometimes as poison, and in various religious ceremonies. But this is what that world looked like. The red areas are the areas of Greek settlement. It was a time of colonization. And so this red area was the Greek-speaking world. This is what that world looked like in the 4th century BCE, which is around the time when Alexander the Great died. This is the Hellenistic world, and separated into different kingdoms. But you see that that area has extended pretty far to the east. And what that means is that the people in the area that we think of as modern day Greece, but this whole area was the Greek world in ancient times, they are all trading different products with each other, including plants from all over this region in all these different climates, all these different terrains. And that is important for us, and it's important for the development of different practices in ancient religion and magic. So this is the Roman world. So we're jumping forward in time. So this is the 2nd century CE. And so this is the time you recognize the Colosseum, different bridges and aqueducts built all over the Roman world, and the Roman world extended all the way to modern day Britain and overlapped quite extensively with the Greek speaking world, but all of them were kind of centered as we see it around the Mediterranean. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the things that affects plants and the natural world is the environment and the landscape. So the type of landscapes that we're looking at that we know existed in ancient times, even though the climate may have been slightly different, but we don't think it's that different. You have these some coastal plains and some arable land. And so these are actually, this is in Greece and this is in Tuscany. So, but you see they're very similar. The arable land kind of looks like this. And then you have in Greece and the Balkans, you have this very rocky mountainous terrain. And also in parts of Italy and going all around the Mediterranean, you see these mountainous volcanic islands, rugged terrain. You have some of the plants that you'd expect in those areas are different than what you might expect in the areas with these big fields of arable land. And then you also have coastal plains. So this is a peninsula just in Greece, and this is the Nile River. And you can see it gets pretty deserty, but right along here, different plants can grow and different crops and things like that can grow to be cultivated. And so this is kind of a range of the terrain that you might find around the Mediterranean world, as well as a little bit inland. And so one of the things to keep in mind with these large sprawling worlds like Greek-speaking or Latin-speaking worlds is that there are a lot of products and commodities being traded, and a lot of those goods are foodstuff or things that are grown, right, plants. And so this is just a snapshot of different images that I have that encapsulate what the ancient economy was like and what was being transferred from one place to another through the different sea routes and also land routes. So obviously, since they're around the Mediterranean Sea, there's a lot of fishing and sailing, shipbuilding. So you needed trees, you needed sap from trees to use to seal the boats to make them waterproof, things like that. So they were using tree product often to ship metals back and forth. This is a grove of olive pickers. So olives were a major commodity being traded around the ancient world, both the olives themselves as the fruit, as well as the wood. And this is a plant called SILPHIUM, which I'll talk about later. And it was so important to the local economy in Cyrene, which is in Northern Africa, that they put it on their coins, just to say like, this is a town that honors and respects and values this plant called SILPHIUM. This is an image of papyrus, which is in the Minoan context, so the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is not from Egypt, but we see that there's evidence of trade or growth of this product east of Egypt. This is the goddess Demeter, the goddess of the grain. So on vase paintings, you'll often see even decoratively pictures of plants, and whether they're cultivated like wheat or sometimes just flowers or leaves. And, you know, there's marble and building projects going on everywhere. And a lot of the plants you see here, which most people look at the Acropolis and look at the buildings, but one of the things to keep in mind is, so this sort of rocky terrain that I was talking about in Greece, it support, like certain types of plants support or grow on that rocky terrain and sort of shore up that area. And then here is a use of papyrus, which is to write texts on and communicate. And so for our next slide, I wanted to just show, this is the trading routes that we're kind of dealing with. And so this is kind of the furthest expanse that they reach, you can see that just the roads, the Romans built these roads, many of which still, you can still see the ruins of them. They still can be used as roads. And then you also see these trade routes that go across the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. And so you have all of these goods going back and forth. And so it's important to understand that the ancient world that I'm talking about, the Greco-Roman ancient world, which is basically from, before the 8th century BCE, although that's our earliest written source. But we're talking, even 1200 BC up until, the medieval periods. The end of the Roman world is around 5th, 6th century CE. During that whole time, we're talking about a multicultural world with a lot of trade and a lot of practices and rituals and religious beliefs being exchanged across this large area from many different contexts. And another aspect to know about is that most people in the Greco-Roman world were polytheistic. And just to give you a sense, this is just the family tree of the gods from one of our earliest works, Hesiod's Theogony from the 8th or 7th, early 7th century BCE, listing the family tree of the gods, and including the major Olympian gods, which you would recognize perhaps like Zeus and Hera and Poseidon and those major Olympians. But then there are a lot of other gods that exist in the world. And so we get into this frame of religion and magic, which is what I wanted to sort of give you a very brief snapshot of what that looks like. So, I showed you what the world looked like, what the landscape looked like, what some of the economy and trade look like, what the communication networks look like. And now this is sort of the mental landscape of religion and magic and belief in the ancient world. So in a polytheistic world, you have a world that is teeming with deities. So, for us, who many of us weren't raised polytheistic, the question is, where are all of these gods? Where do they exist? Where, we know the Olympians exist on Mount Olympus or in the sky or things like that, and they're the underworld gods, but all the other gods that the ancients believed in, they were scattered throughout the natural world, including in all of the plants and trees. So you hear about wood nymphs and river nymphs and sea nymphs and things like that. And so there was always this sacred element to plants and trees in the ancient world, and this idea that you were in contact with something that's not only natural, but also perhaps supernatural. And my definition of religion that I will use today is religion is sanctioned magic, and magic is unsanctioned religion. So, there are many definitions of religion and magic that I do discuss with my students when I teach a whole class on ancient religion and magic. But for our purposes, so I wanted to just impress upon you that religion and magic in the ancient world, they had a lot of overlap. And one of the areas that overlapped was the importance of ritual and rites, which is called orthopraxy. That means correct practice. And the importance of that over even belief, like orthodoxy, meaning correct belief. And so most the modern religions that people know about, like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, they're orthodoxic, meaning that you have to believe in order to practice them. But in the ancient world, practice of religion was more important, like going through the motions was emphasized more than belief in what you were doing. And so when you have rituals and rites that must be observed very correctly in a particular order over time, and especially with the rise of priestly classes, they become more elaborate and they have more steps and they require more sacrifices. And so they would require certain concoctions that you would put certain plants and whether they're wild or whether they're cultivated into these mixtures with honey or milk or water and mash them together. And maybe there could be some psychedelic things that people might also drink as part of their religious ritual alongside with animal sacrifices. And the word sacrifice just means to make something sacred, to make something special in a way, in a religious sense. And sacrifices in the ancient world involved both animals and plants. We mostly think about animal sacrifice, but plant sacrifice and usage of plants was always a part of that. And the other thing I want to emphasize was just how much religion and magic, or what we might even call superstition today, but was actual religious practice often in the ancient world, was integrated into daily life and into all official actions in a way that it's sometimes hard for us to understand in our context. So for example, no business could be completed until after the sacrifices were done. And if the omens and the sacrifices came back like that it was an inauspicious day, you wouldn't conduct business. It would, because you could bring a war or a drought or a famine on you. So, you could not take any action until a religious ritual was performed. And the priests came and they either made a small sacrifice, reading the entrails, or they, burned some offerings, whether, often with animals, but also with plants to the gods. So no business could happen without sacrifice. So religion and belief and the practice and the use of the aspects and elements of that, which includes plants, was just part of the everyday life. And so some of the uses and powers of plants were food, right? So consumption and production, you have to, as the population grew and people traveled around, there was more desire for exotic types of food or spices or things like that. And so especially the spice trade was very prominent, especially as corridors into the east opened up and different foods were shared or passed around, different crops around the Mediterranean. But then also there's this aspect of plants that was considered not just for feeding the body, but also feeding the soul, and using aspects of religion and magic, as I said. And so you would use plants to create situations of protection and prosperity, as well as in the areas of medicine, healing, and even poison. And so this word pharmakon is the word that you will see in the ancient texts, meaning a drug or a medicine or a poison. It's used for all of those things. And we get our word pharmacy from that. And what we see, before I continue, I notice I have some hands up, and I wonder if there's stuff just before I get into the plant part, if we want to, I can look at some of the questions. Were there any things?
Yeah, a couple have come in, Suzanne. One registrant is asking for the source of the Pantheon family tree, if you have that available.
I got that just off of the internet. If you just look up Hesiod Theogony, Polytheism, it's from, I think it might be originally from Hunter's translation, one of the Oxford translations. But. Wonderful.
And a second question came in, were certain plants or animals more pleasing to the gods than others, or were there some that were deity specific?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, there were certain, depending on what the plant was used for, there were different gods or different deities that governed those areas. And so often in the text, in Greek text, when you hear any mention of plants or of plant products, for sacrifices, it's generally barley or some form of meal. We translate it like that. We don't know exactly, like some form of wheat, but often those are mixed with honey and milk and water. And, sometimes they'll say mash it into a paste. And I'll show you shortly a passage from Homer's Odyssey that talks about a plant that we have no idea what it is, but it names a plant. And it talks about what it looks like, but we don't know what it is. We can't verify. Okay, are there any other questions?
Those are the only two at this time, but feel free to submit more in the Q&A section, everyone.
Great. So I will continue now into the plant sections, but I just wanted to orient you guys into the what the world was like that we're looking at. And now I want to talk about plant experts, because we do know that there were people considered to be experts in plants. Generally, everybody, it seems, just from what you read in different sources, it seems that everybody had some knowledge of plants and some knowledge of things that were good to eat or not good to eat. Kind of like what we might know, like you may, have tea if you are feeling ill. You may have, I think chamomile tea is something that Peter Rabbit used to drink when he was sick. And so people might have some sense of different medicinal properties. Like I've heard, if you have a stomach ache, you might drink ginger tea or something like that. And so you might have a caffeinated tea if you need a little pick-me-up in the afternoon. So people in the ancient world also had this understanding that different plants had different effects on the human body. The problem we have is that there's not a lot of detailed info because plant knowledge was considered everyday knowledge. And the plants that were used for the most elaborate religious rituals, those people were not writing manuals. It was one of those hand-me-down sort of things, and it was considered hidden or sacred knowledge. And so those aren't written down either. And so what we as scholars, when we're looking back trying to figure this out, we have a lot of text with a lot of by the way, this, so-and-so threw this plant in the mix when they were going to, and made a poultice on a wound or something like that. But there was an assumption in the things that we've read that we as the audience would know what they were talking about. But every once in a while you do get a description of things, and we do have a description of certain types of plant experts that were mostly itinerant experts who would go from city to city. And a lot of quote unquote magicians or wise men did this. They went from city to city or town to town and maybe took up a residency there. People would pay them for their services, and then they'd move on to the next town. So we know that there were these herbalists called rhizotomoi, and that literally just means root cutters. And they would be the ones you would go to buy different herbs. And herbs involve the use of pretty much all parts of the plant. So in the ancient world, that's what these people would be able to sell you, any part of the plant. You have these drug vendors, pharmakopoloi, and you can see the pharmakos word in there, and poloi is the word for vendor. Hold on, there you go. And it's hard to know what the difference is between the rhizotomoi and the pharmakopoloi. And I think that the latter may have not been as itinerant, but there are texts that say they did move from place to place as well. There were physicians, and there are different words for physicians, but one that comes up is demiurgoi. And so in a lot of medical texts, you will see some reference to use of plants. There were also a lot of natural philosophers and philosophers in general. So philosophers who were thinking about how the world works and what the causes of things were. They are some of our best sources for plants, because they were trying to map out and categorize living things and non-living things in the world, and just map out reality. And they're the ones who had time, resources, and students to take on the project of categorizing plants and thinking about them and passing on that information. And then finally, our other source of plant experts are sorceresses, and this is mainly from literature, but the most famous ones are Circe in Homer's Odyssey, and many of you have heard of Medea and how she was a sorceress who mixed many different potions that could do many different things, whether kill somebody, protect somebody, transform somebody, or even bring people back to life with her potions. and she often collected those things at night, and her patron goddess was Hecate. And so with that question about were there any gods that were particular to different plants, many of the plants that are considered sorceresses plants, they seem to be associated with a chthonic goddess, sort of an underworld goddess like Hecate, sort of the hidden aspect of, and dark, maybe dark magic, although the ancients wouldn't have seen it necessarily that way, but we might call it dark magic. And so this is a passage about Circe from Homer's Odyssey. So I'll just read it so that you can listen or read along. So the goddess Circe ushered Odysseus's men in, gave them all seats, high or low, and blended for them a dish of cheese and of barley meal, of yellow honey and Pramnian wine, all together. But with these good things, she mingled pernicious drugs as well, to make them forget their own country utterly. Having given them this and waited for them to have their fill, she struck them suddenly with her wand, then drove them into the sties where she kept her pigs. And now the men had the form of pigs, the snout and grunt and bristles, only their minds were left unchanged. So this is such an interesting passage, one of our earliest, where it mentions the pharmakon, the drug, a drug, right? And she also is using a wand, so a particular type of wood that was made into a wand. If you are Harry Potter fans, you know that there are different wands made of different woods. We do not know what Circe's wand, or Hermes' wand for that matter, was made out of, but there was this idea that they were made out of a special bark or special tree. And these herbs were very powerful, as you see. It could transform physically a person, but also transform them mentally, right? So either, could make them forget their country, and that's Odysseus and his men, that's all they wanted to do was get home, but she made them forget their big goal in life. So maybe some form of psychedelic. But then once that wore off, after she had transformed them to pigs, they still, they had a different body than their mind. So so these plants, these particular drugs, can alter reality for people. So there's that sense there. And then in defense, Odysseus goes to rescue his men at Circe's house, and the Argeophontes, that's Hermes, gave me the herb, drawing it from the ground, and showed me its nature. At the root, it was black, but its flower was like milk. Moliu, the gods call it, and it is hard for mortal men to dig, but with the gods, all things are possible. So this is our earliest mention of a specific plant that is described this way. And it's often in English, it's often written as moly, M-O-L-Y. I've just transcribed it from the Greek as M-O-L-U. And so you see, it's a black root with white flowers. Very vague, but maybe people knew what it was, or maybe it was a mystery as well to the audience. So now that's our earliest reference. Now I'm going to jump ahead to this philosopher named Theophrastus of Eresus, because now we get deep into the plant, what we know about plants in the ancient world. We know mostly from Theophrastus of Eresus. And so he was a peripatetic philosopher from Lesbos, and what that means is his career was philosopher. That was his job. He was a student of Aristotle, and then succeeded him as the head of the Lyceum in Athens. And so this was a very important person in the history of philosophy, very important philosopher. And he's also considered maybe the father of Western botany, because his system of categorization of plants was the system until about the 18th century, in the Common Era, or AD. And what he did was he cataloged plants based on all aspects, the root, the leaf, the seeds, and he wanted to understand all aspects. And he wrote two major books, or I guess works is more like it, on plants: An Inquiry into Plants, which is 9 books long, and also Plant Explanations, which is 6 books. And Plant Explanations is just about the causes and effects of different plants, and then the parts of plants. And so these are our 2 major works that we know about. We don't have them all. We don't even have a lot of the direct writings of Theophrastus. We just hear about him from other people, but we know that these two things he wrote. And so in that work, he described many different plants. And so for the next little part of this talk, before we head into questions, is I just want to give you some case studies of some really famous plants that he and others wrote about. But I want you to know, this is the father of Western botany. And now I will run you through just a couple case studies so you see some actual plants, the ones that we know about sort of and think that we know about. So Egyptian papyrus, Cyperus papyrus. This was a major commodity in the ancient world. This is what it looks like. I used to live in Los Angeles. It grows everywhere because Los Angeles has a Mediterranean climate, and you can plant it easily. You can't really see it well here, but it's actually a triangle shaped stem. And you can see this is what it looks like in the wild. And this is a picture of it. And the fact that somebody painted it on a wall decoratively, but also shows its importance. And that papyrus is, the Egyptians discovered fairly early that you could make it into this material that you can write on. And so very important for us, because this is where a lot of our sources from the ancient world came from, is on papyrus scrolls that have survived, whether in cartons or on mummies, in the cartonnage of mummies. And so this is where we have a lot of knowledge of the ancient world, is on papyrus. So very important plant for the ancients and also for us. There was a big trade in papyrus. It was fairly cheap because it was so bountiful and so available. The other plant that you may have heard of is pennyroyal. Maybe you've heard that Nirvana song, Pennyroyal Tea. Pennyroyal is an ancient plant. Mentha PULEGIUM is as close. So I'm giving you these scientific names for as close as we think they are. So this is what that looks like. In the ancient world, it was considered an aphrodisiac, a contraceptive, and abortifacient. And it's served well as a tea or even a potion. And we hear a lot about it in the 5th century in comedy and in any texts that are about women or about flute girls or sex slaves or things like that, or sex workers. You will often hear that they are experts in the use of pennyroyal. Another one that's, I don't know if you've heard of this plant, it's called SQUILL, URGINEA maritima, and beautiful purple plant. It was extremely important in the ancient world. It was used for purification and for protection from evil. And so what people would do is they would plant it around their house and do a ritual with it around their house to ward off evil spirits. And you might do that regularly, at least annually, but maybe more often, especially if something happened. It was also a part of this unique religious ritual from the Greek world, which is the scapegoat ritual, where often a city-state, a town or city would assign a prisoner to take on the ills and of all the city, and then they would banish that person. So they would treat that scapegoat for maybe a year. They would feed them and treat them as a hero and glorify them, and then they would use squill and sort of hit them with the squill and chase them out of the city. And that was supposed to protect the city for the whole year. And so, and protect it from what? Protect from plague, from war, and from drought. And so squill during our current pandemic times might have been seen as maybe we need more squill in our lives as we try to ward off the different things that we need protection from. And the last one I want to talk about, because it is really famous, is SILPHIUM. FERULA tingitana, we think, may be related to the fennel plant. It appears in cookbooks. It appears in Apicius's cookbook, which is one of the few cookbooks that have survived from the 1st century CE. It also appears in a lot of healing treatises and medical treatises. So in the Hippocratic Papers, it said it was used for cough or sore throat, fever, indigestion, aches and pains, warts, and every other kind of malady, headaches, you name it. It was sort of a cure-all. it was also it's also most famous, I think, to, if anybody has heard of it now, as a contraceptive and abortifacient. And so that's where I first heard about it, and that's where most people who have heard about it heard about that particular aspect, because that was written about quite a lot in ancient texts. So because it was so popular in all these uses, it was a huge commodity in trade. It grows in North Africa, kind of in shallow soil, on these kind of in the coastal plains. And it has a very narrow band of survival, like and it may or may not have been cultivated a lot. Like we just don't know. We think it might have been hard to cultivate, because what happened is it was cultivated or traded to extinction because it was so popular. And as I said, it was on the coin of the city of Cyrene, which was a major port of trade and a major location from which SILPHIUM would be distributed around the Mediterranean. And so this is what we think it looks like. And it may be related to fennel. It looks a little like fennel plant, maybe related to that. We have no idea. Sorry, there. So this is where Cyrene was. And so this is the coins of Cyrene. And it was printed multiple times, stamped multiple times on coins. So it just shows the importance of this particular plant for the economy of that region, and as a plant that moved around the Mediterranean. And so in conclusion, I just wanted to say, like, about plants in the ancient world, they were an integral part of everyday life, and also an integral part of official religious practice. They were thought to have natural and supernatural powers. It was a way of being in contact with the natural world, but also a way of activating unseen forces, the supernatural forces of the world. And they were used for healing, protection, and magic, as well as food, as I mentioned. And they were also just more generally an accessible form of contact and control by humans over a world that was maybe supernatural or beyond the ability for most people to understand. So this was a form of empowerment. Being knowledgeable about different plants and their uses was a form of empowerment in the ancient world. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening to my lecture today.
All right, thank you so much, Suzanne. This was fascinating. A few more great questions have come in since our last stopping point. The first, I know you covered many centuries over this lecture, but could you speak a bit about the population size, I guess either of the world or the ancient area?
Yeah, I actually don't know. I should know that, but I mean, the height of Rome probably was 500,000, and in Athens it was, probably a little less than that. So I mainly know the big centers, but it wasn't like a modern city.
Sure. I'm really glad this question came in because I was trying to wrap my head around it. But could you talk about the making process of papyrus? I'm trying to wrap my head around how that plant.
Yes. Oh, thanks for asking. Whoever asked that, thanks for asking. I had to do that actually for a papyrology class when I was in graduate school. And so I wish I had a picture, but you can Google what a papyrus plant looks like, right? And so it's triangular. The stem is triangular. And what you do is you take a thin knife, a thin blade, and you would strip off thin strips of the papyrus. So you have these thin strips, and then you would weave them together like this, create like a square of them woven together with those thin strips that you've stripped off of the fresh papyrus. And then you take like a stone and you just mash them. You'd mash it. And so papyrus, the reason papyrus is useful in this way is like it has really thick cell walls. And when you mash those cell walls, they break down and they bind to each other. So the juice kind of binds and the broken cell walls bind to each other. And then you dry things out. And then it creates, and then once it's dried, it creates what you see as papyrus. And what they did is these long strips. And so when you saw that the scroll that I showed in that one picture, that's how papyrus was shipped and how it was used. The book form, the codex, was a much later technology. The original form were these long scrolls, and you just clip it to the size that you wanted.
So the scrolls themselves are pretty thin, but the binds are strong. Is that what I'm hearing?
The binds are very strong. Yeah, and one thing that's interesting, I was trying to see if I have any, actually I have some papyrus in my office, so hold on, let me just grab it. I did not anticipate this question, but I happen to have a ream of papyrus in my office. So you can actually kind of see, you see the weaving? The other side. And so there's some imperfections in there as well. And then this has just been clipped to size, you can see. So it's not even clipped on the you know, along the line. So anyway, but you can buy this on Amazon if you want, and you can write on it. I have my students in my ancient magic and religion class. Sometimes they'll write. So these were used for everyday writing, but also for curse tablets. Like you could perform curses against people to like hurt their business or make them fall in love with you or other things. And so you would write something on here and then bury it. You would fold it and then bury it, or have it like at the person's house or right outside of their business where they maybe couldn't find it. Sometimes you would write something on a papyrus and put it in an amulet you'd wear on your body as a protective amulet. So yeah, you would use papyrus. You would also use lead because it was thin, cheap, and widely available and easy to write on.
Very fascinating. Thank you for having that available to share.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. As I said, I love having papyrus around because it's so fun to, like, you can see, you can scroll it. Yeah, everybody should just buy some papyrus and have it in their house. It's really fun. The one thing my students discover, though, is that not all inks work on papyrus. They don't all stay on papyrus. The ancient, whatever inks they use were also plant products. And so what they did in the ancient world, they'd write and then they'd steam the papyrus, and that would set the ink into the papyrus. Modern inks are made of something different. So if you actually do that process, then the ink actually doesn't stay in the papyrus. It's the opposite.
Right. Now we have a plant question
Okay.
regarding squill. Is it edible or is it poisonous? Like how is the squill used?
That's a great question. I had to look this up because it's not, like, I've seen the word in Greek, but I didn't know what the English was for it. And squill is, I don't even know how that name came up, but it is edible. All parts are edible. And like most of these medicinal things, medicinal drugs, pharmacon, in certain quantities or in certain distillations, they are poisonous. They will cause, like, some of these are purgatives. So they're meant to, you know, if you have a stomach ache, it'll make you throw up if you have it in a more concentrated form. And so often, especially later, like in the Roman period, women were often associated with witches. Often these were women who were experts at herbs. So they were both, people would go to them to get love potions or healing potions for different illnesses, but then they would also be accused of being witches and chased out of town if things went wrong. Like if somebody died from having too much of that love potion or giving too much of that love potion to somebody they wanted to fall in love with them. So often single older women who were unmarried had this association. So there was a gendered element as well to the use of plants. So a lot of the doctors, the itinerant doctors, were male, but the local local people you would go to were often women.
Next, we have a clarification question. Did you mention that the Odyssey had the earliest mention of plant descriptions?
In the text that I look at in Greek, yes. But there are, like, that image of the papyrus is Minoan, and so that's older.
Right. Could you speak a bit about the use of plants by oracles or for answering questions or for the prophecy?
Yeah, so the oracle at Delphi is the most famous one, the oracle, right, that most people probably have heard of, but there were many oracles. And there were also local oracles in different towns, but the most famous one, she's often represented sitting with a bowl of something. And we don't know what that is. There's this word in Greek, kukeon, which is like a mixture, a potion. It's often just translated as potion. But like scholars have thought, well, maybe that the oracle, the woman, the young woman who was the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, she may have just been high on something, whether it's natural gases, because a lot of these oracle sites happen to be on very, I guess, active, plate tectonically active areas. So there might be gases released from the earth that give people a buzz. But if that wasn't working, then she would be drinking something that would make her go into, I mean, the description is like she'd go into a trance and then she'd start chanting, and she might be having something that looks like a seizure. So we think that they definitely were some form of psychedelic to help things along.
All right, it looks like we talked about papyrus for a while, and some more questions came in about papyrus. So was dried or fresh papyrus more valued, and did the purpose make a difference?
It was only sold dry. It wasn't, you can't actually write on it when it's wet. It's very juicy. Like when you crush when you crush the papyrus, it's really, I mean, it kind of makes a mess. So they had, huge production facilities in Egypt for papyrus, and would just lay it out to dry in that hot Egyptian sun. And in terms of uses, what was the question about uses? There are different uses. They would use it for everything. It was just like the way we use paper in all of its forms, they could use papyrus in all of its forms.
Now, is it proven to be more long lasting than paper? Do we have that?
That's a great question. I don't know. It depends on the conditions. So papyrus is a plant product, so it is biodegradable. It does break down. The reason we have the papyrus we do have mostly comes from Egypt because of the dry, hot environment. But we know that there was a lot of papyrus elsewhere in the Mediterranean, but we don't find any elsewhere because it would have broken down like a lot of biodegradables. Paper wasn't introduced to the West for a long time. The next step in the writing process was what's used on the codex, which is animal skin, which is scraped until it's so thin that it kind of looks like paper. And again, with that, as with papyrus, the ink would have to absorb slightly into that material to stick. And then paper was much later.
And our last couple of questions are really just about additional resources. One person specifically is interested in your paper on gender identities in the ancient world. If that's available, but if you have any recommendations for resources or books where people can learn more about this topic, we'd be happy to take those.
About plants in particular, or about magic in the ancient world?
I would say all the above.
All the above. Well, there's some good. One of the sources I use there's an article in this book, Magica Hiera, by Christopher Ferroni and Dirk Alvink. It's just an article that talks about herbal and sacred uses of plants, but it's very scholarly, so it's not like a general, like it's kind of dense to get through, as my students tell me. It's hard to read. Let me think. Radcliffe Edmonds, who teaches at Bryn Mawr, has some books on magic in the ancient world that are pretty good. So that may be more accessible. And so, yeah, I think that's, and Christopher Ferroni. If you want to read more about like love magic, he wrote the book called Ancient Love Magic. So you could read more about and again, often you'll have to read about plants. I haven't been able to find one book that's just about plants in the ancient world, except maybe the ancient treatises, but those are very hard to read. So mostly I read books on magic, and there's a source book by Daniel Ogden. If you want to, there's a chapter. Let's see. So it's just called Magic in the Ancient World. In the ancient, I think it's the ancient Greek and Roman world. And so that book is a good, it's a source book, so you can read a lot of primary sources of what people actually said, not just an interpretation of what people said. And so you kind of have to read around, because again, they're just these little mentions of, and then, you know, like even, oh, there's also the Greek Magical Papyri, which I think you can look up online. There's a translation just available. The Greek Magical Papyri, that's a source of a lot of our knowledge of ancient plants in the earlier period. So if you want to read medical texts, you can read like Galen and Hippocratic Papers and later authors, even medieval authors. So medical texts will have some things. The Greek Magical Papyri are awesome, because you can actually see, like they say, okay, you know, to ward off a headache, take, you know, this plant, do a purification ritual over it, and then put it on your head or something, you know, so it's kind of half, it's a manual for practitioners. So they don't go into a ton of detail, but they'll mention different plants to use.
We had one more question come in. This registrant was saw the coin that you had shown earlier, and her impression was that that's a cup plant, Silphium perfoliatum. Sorry, my Latin is awful. And the plant slide featured a photo of that cup with a flower. Do you know if there's a relation to the original Silphium that you mentioned that was commoditized to extinction?
Honestly, scholars don't know at all. I've looked this up so much because my students are fascinated by it, because its main use, as I said, or its main famous use in literature is as an abortifacient, and birth control in the ancient world. And so that's an area that a lot of scholars have looked into. We really have no idea what that plant is. The one I gave you is the closest they think it might be. And they say it kind of looks like a giant fennel, but it's not. It's a different family than the giant fennel. And what scholars of the ancient world are looking at that coin and trying to see what other plants grow in the area now. And so they really don't know.
And I'm not sure if I just didn't hear you, but are we able to read your paper on gender identities, or are there any of your works that will be accessible to this audience?
Let's see. I have a page. If you go, I have an academia.edu page. If you just email me if there's a particular, because the gender identities article I think you're referring to is I wrote it on this ancient novel called Heliodorus. So if you're interested in the ancient novel, then yeah, I'm happy to share that. Just email me, and you can email me.
Right. Well, that seems to do it for the questions. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for sharing this topic with us. This was truly fascinating. And thank everyone for joining us today. We offer these virtual Lunchbox talks on the 2nd and 4th Thursday of each month, and we're working on more fall programming. So check back periodically on our calendar. I'll share some links in the chat for everyone. If you're not currently a member, we certainly hope that you'll consider becoming one. Membership is crucial to our mission. And Suzanne, do you have any parting words?
Just thank you so much for being here, and for listening to this, and thanks for taking this dive with me into this particular fascinating aspect of the ancient world, which we don't know very much about, but was an important aspect of life in the ancient world. So I appreciate you all.
Well, thanks again for being here. Thank you all for attending, and I hope to see you at the garden soon.